Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem. Alhamdulillah, today we will be talking about the science of Ihsan, also called Tasawwuf. We will discuss its history, scholars, and many issues that need clarification. We will also be talking about another important issue related to the subject, which is the Hanbalis and their Ihsan. And so our guest today is Shaykh Abu Ja'far Al-Hanbali. Welcome and Assalamu alaikum ya Shaykh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
So Alhamdulillah, thank you for being here again with us. And I'd like to begin about this topic of Ihsan and Tasawwuf. And so I'd like to ask you first, what is Ihsan or Tasawwuf? And where did it come from? What was its beginning? If you could tell us this.
Okay. الحمد لله الحمد لله وكفى والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده وبعد. To go back to the topic on Tasawwuf for Ihsan is to return back to the hadith of Jibreel. Now there are two hadith on Jibreel. One, which is where he's showing the Rasul alayhi salatu wassalam wudu, as well as salah. There is another in which he comes to him and asks him questions about the religion. And he asks about what we know as the four rings. These four rings are when he asks about what is Islam, what is Iman, what is Ihsan, and what are the signs of time, or when is the hour. So for Islam, these are the external acts of Islam, which will be the fiqh. The Iman are the matters we know as i'tiqad, which we've already discussed. Fiqh, we've discussed. Signs of time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me to do about, I'd say maybe 26 lessons on that. But then within that fourth ring is Ihsan. And when asked what is Ihsan, he said, to worship Allah as if you see him, and if you do not, know that he sees you. So this is what Ihsan is. And the Muhsineen are the carriers of this. So when he said, this is Jibreel, he came to you to teach you your deen. That means all these things are from the deen. And they are one of the most basic levels that all of the religion can be reduced down to. Fiqh, i'tiqad, ihsan, signs of the time, or yawm al-akhir. Like it can be just reduced down to these matters. Now, ihsan, this is what it was known as. Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi, rahimahullah, the great Usuli and Maliki scholar, in his book Al-I'tisam bis-Sunnah, he explains that the expression of the ihsan of the first generations, he said that originally in that first age, the highest rank of people that you could have were the Sahabi. It was the Sahabi. And then after that, it was the Tabi'een, and then the Tabi'een. And then he mentioned the Ubad and Zuhad, the worshippers, and those who do Zuhud, they abstain from earthly life. But in the fourth age, a word that started gaining more currency, it was in the third age, but it started gaining far more currency, which was the word Tasawwuf. Now, this practice of Tasawwuf, in terms of not its existence, because we're aware of Ihsan, which worshiping Allah as if you see him, and this is the Ahwal al-Qalb, this is the states of the heart and other affairs. But the actual setting down of books and codifying, this began like the Sirah, like Jarh wa Ta'dil and Hadith, like so many other things, it began in Al-Basra. The Imam Taqiyuddin Taymiyyah in volume 11 of Majmu' Fatawa, which is Kitab al-Tasawwuf, begins by giving the history of this term and what Tasawwuf is. And he explains the wellspring of it in terms of the codification happened in Al-Basra and also fed into Al-Baghdad. So this is where we first have codification and setting down of principles. So it existed before, but the first pinning of works, the first concerted effort to make an explanation of it was in Al-Basra and Baghdad. Secondly, during this time, you had people who wrote in the area of Tasawwuf, but their literature was not definitive. And the reason why their literature was not definitive is because they did not define terms. What is ikhlas? What is yaqeen? What is iyan? What is iyan? What is inaya? What is fana? What do these things mean? These words were not being defined systematically. So what was happening is books were using these expressions, but without defining terms. So what happened was people set down books. The best people that sat down books were in Al-Basra to define these terms. So in this case, the first one to define in terms was Al-Junaid al-Baghdadi, who is listed in Tabaqat al-Hanabila as one of our ancient elders, rahimahullah. Now, he lived from 221 to 298, and his Rasa'il were taken from As-Sirri al-Saqti, as well as a student through Ma'ruf al-Karhi. Now, Ma'ruf al-Karhi is one of the students of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah. And he learned Tasawwuf anything from Imam Ahmad. SubhanAllah. And Imam Ahmad at the time was very skeptical of Harith and Muhasibi and other people at the time because they didn't define terms. And one of the criticisms he had was not that they were practicing Ihsan or Tasawwuf. It was that they were saying things without clearly laying down terms and principles. Just like he had the issue with profusion of fatwa without explaining the principles behind the sihha or du'afa of a hadith. He had the same criticism. So Al-Junaid al-Baghdadi, rahimahullah, takes from Sirri Saqati, who dies 251, as well as a student through Ma'ruf al-Karhi, who's one of the great Sufis. I mean, Ibrahim al-Harbi, who lived after, he's also a student through. He said that making dua at the grave of Ma'ruf al-Karhi is sure to be answered. So these are high-ranking people. So he sets down in his book, Rasa'il. It's a series of Rasa'il, collections of different things, letters he received from people that he wrote back to them. Then he answers other things. He sat down and wrote books that specifically define things like what is wedged, what is hal, what are these things. He made a concerted effort to define terms. Now, this methodology then of writing down terms goes to Abu Bakr, Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Sayyid Hamduway al-Hashimi, who dies 310. He also is writing down terms. And one of the reasons why writing down and defining terms and systematizing is important, because during this time you had Zuhad and Ubad who were engaged in looking for hal. They were looking for these conditions where they have these ecstatic utterances and these other things were occurring. Sometimes these utterances were of shaitan, but sometimes these utterances were from Allah, but they were times where their body was short-circuiting because of what was happening to them. And the point of ihsan is that that doesn't happen. That's not a state that you seek. Because when you look in all the ahadith and all the ayat, all of them, when they list the angels making salah or making dhikr, they're all sober and focused, either making sujood or ruku' or standing in salah or gathered in dhikr. They're all sober-minded. And this is why Junaid is called, Sahibul Tariqain. He's the possessor of the two paths, the Sharia and the Haqiqah, because he understood that the only way you can deal with these ecstatic utterances, whether they're coming from Allah or the shaitan, is to actually clearly systematize the principles so that people can grasp it.
And so the first three generations, they were always sober, all of them.
All of these were sober. The issue of movement in dhikr in terms of, say, jumping or clapping or piercing the skin with weapons, or subjecting oneself to flagellation or whipping. This was not of the first three generations. It's not to say that there weren't people that had ecstatic incidents that did this. There were, but that was not the amal of the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and the Tabi'een. It was not their methodology. So after this, we then reached the age of Abu Salih, Muflih ibn Abdullah Ad-Dimashqi, who died 300 Hijri. Now, he's a towering figure because he died in Damascus. Now, he died 300. Imam Ahmed died 241 Hijri.
Right.
That means he knew the students of Imam Ahmed and might have known al-Barbahari and these type of people. And he was one of the first Sufis to have a masjid. It's called Jami' Bani Salih, and it still stands to this day, dedicated to this great man of Ihsan and Tasawwuf in Damascus. So he wrote down some things with regard to adhkar that one can do, adhkar that one can engage in, different sunan dua and qira of Quran, and also at the time what your heart should be like, what states your heart should be going through when this happens. And this set of principles he bequeathed to another great imam, who at the time there were two great imams who were writing down and systematizing knowledge and explaining things, one of whom was Al-Mubarak ibn Abdullah ibn al-Husayn, who lived from 446 to 513. Now we know him as Abu Sa'd al-Mukharrimi, a great scholar of Baghdad who was reputed to have only ate once every 2 days or once every 3 days. He had his Madrasatul Mukharrimi, which is a big madrasa. And then there's the great Afghani saint and wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Abu Isma Al-Ansari, who dies 481. Now he writes the Manazil As-Sa'irin, which is literally a guidebook of the terms of Ihsan and Tasawwuf, what they lead to, how they go through, how you go through the different stages. I translated that into English, alhamdulillah. Yes. And that book has a sharh on it by Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who will probably be speaking about him later with regard to Tasawwuf and these other affairs. So these two men, in writing down these principles, they're important because Abu Sa'd al-Mukharrami and Abu Ismail al-Ansari are sort of looked at as muhtasibin, like quality checkers. Because during the time of their setting down the books that they put together, there was an inordinate amount of people claiming hal, claiming access to the unseen, claiming that they could change areas of the unseen. And so everyone was going to different sheikhs who claimed this, because you had Manichaeans coming into Islam, you had some Tatars in a trickle entering Islam, and other people that were bringing shamanistic and other beliefs into the religion. And so they were quality checkers in their time. And they gave their quality checking wound up spiritually and intellectually giving birth to the Sultan of the Awliya, our grand Sheikh, Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani, rahimahullah, who he dies in 561 Hijri. Now he makes it his business to not only write books of Tasawwuf in striking detail and contrast, but to also attack what's going on in his lifetime. It was his supposition that what was happening in his lifetime was because of theological errors, and also because of blatant sin that was being done, that the people that were displaying themselves as sheikhs of Sufiya and things like this is why in his Kitab Sirr al-Asrar, he has a listing of fake Sufis. And all of the things he lists are matters that we see today. Now, in the process of this, he takes over the madrasa of his teacher, Abu Sa'd al-Mukharrimi. After he dies, he takes over that madrasa. So when you look at where the Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani, rahimahullah, our grand Shaykh, is buried in Baghdad, that's the original masjid that he took over. He's buried on the grounds of that masjid. And so is Abu Sa'd al-Mukharrimi. And so still his sunnah of feeding people carries on every Thursday. Sometimes they do Wednesdays and Thursdays. The point of what he did by building his Jama'ah is he built what's known as a Zawiyah. And a Zawiyah was generally an enclosure inside of a masjid or a small building to the side of a masjid. Now, this small building was there for the purpose of students that were staying at a hostel or needed a hostel to stay at could stay there and review their literature in private and in a group without disturbing people in the masjid. Because, as you know, unless you're teaching a lesson or other things, you're not supposed to raise your voice in the masjid unless you're teaching or you're citing a hadith. So when these students in the hostel are reviewing their lessons, they don't want to disturb people who are engaged in dhikr, people who are making their ratiba, tahiyyatul masjid, or if there's a khutbah that's happening, or a Thursday night dars. Sometimes, because it was the habit of the Rasul والسلام, to do a Thursday night dars and to take questions. And that's where the famous hadith, alaykum bis-sunnati wa sunnati al-khulafa ar-rashidin al-mahdiyyin min ba'di, that wasn't a khutbah on Friday, that was Thursday. Because he would give a Thursday address. So to keep from disrupting that, because Abu Sa'id Al-Mukharrimi used to give a Thursday address. So to keep from disrupting people, he built that. It was also a place to deal with people who were rededicating themselves to Islam after having been far from Allah. So these were sometimes women who had been sexually abused by their husbands, men who sometimes were drunkards, and he had found them laying in the street in their own vomit, picked them up, carried them to the Zawiyah, cleaned them up, and told them how it's not over for them yet, and to not despair of Allah's rahmah, and similar things such as this. So this was the methodology. And it was just known very simply as the tariq. Often people around them called it ta'ifa Hanbaliya, the Hanbali way, right? So this is what this tariq, this ta'ifa, this is what its goal was rectifying the condition of the Muslim brother. And the condition, as we see from there all the way down to now, to Abdullah, Sufyan al-Qudumi, rahimahullah, and others, can be summed up in three things. Ta'aleem, learning and teaching, usually by hifz of matun or learning matun. Tahkim, learning which parts apply to you and which apply to other people so that you understand what you're correctly doing. And number three, tatbiq, implementation. These three things were the methodology that and subsequent imams based their methodology upon. In the background of this, the Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani rahimahullah gathered around him students, but his successors he was very particular about. His successors took from him tahkim, ta'aleem, tahkim, and tatbiq, because they copied the same process. These successors of the Shaykh include Muwafiquddin ibn Qudamah rahimahullah, who died 620 of the Hijri, Abu Umar al-Maqdisi, who died 607 Hijri, Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, who died 600 Hijri, Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah, who dies 597 of the Hijri, and Abu Idris al-Ba'qubi from Ba'qub in Baghdad, he dies 619. These successors are the ones that transmit his literature. Books such as Kitab Sir al-Asrar, Al-Fuyudat, Al-Fath al-Rabbani, they've transmitted this literature. So there's no way to escape, as it is, from these men. So the Shaykh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani rahimahullah, he dies in 561. Imam Ibn al-Jawzi, and this is important to dispel. There have been a couple people who've claimed that Ibn Jawzi was not a student of Shaykh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani. This is apocryphal. Firstly, there are two sources of him being a student of the Shaykh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani. The first is Ibn Rajab Al-Hanbali, rahimahullah, citing him as one in volume 4 of Tabaqat al-Hanabila, Al-Zaylu ala Tabaqat al-Hanabila. The second is Imam Yusuf al-Tazifi, who is one of the successors of the Tariq, the successors of the Ta'ifa, who also cites him on several different occasions, being a student of Shaykh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani. So this is utter foolishness. Ibn Jawzi most certainly knew Shaykh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani and was most certainly a student. This comes from grave and hideous ignorance. Now, in terms of in Sham, so we're familiar in Baghdad because Ibn Jawzi is in Baghdad. Abu Idris al-Ba'qubi is in Baghdad. But this Ta'ifa Hanbaliya, this methodology of ta'lim, tahkim, and tatbiq, it finds its flowering in Sham. How? Well, let's go back to it. Muwafiq ad-Din is Abdullah ibn Ahmed ibn Qudamah. This Imam, at one point, his grandfather, Qudamah, met one of the big Imams of the time. And he said, make dua that I memorized the Quran and had pious children. So he made dua for him. And this is what happened with the Qudamah family, Ibn Qudamah family tree.
MashaAllah.
So this flowering in Sham was the realization of this dua. Abu Umar al-Maqdisi, rahimahullah, he goes to build a hostel, which is Ad-Dayr. It was the hostel starting off. They were at Jami bin Abi Salih as well as Ad-Dayr. That's where they were. They were reviewing the literature of Shaykh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani, carrying out their wirds day and night, which obviously we'll talk about, we're talking about there, and also reviewing over their hifz of Al-Khiraqi's Mukhtasar. They were reviewing these things. This was their methodology, as well as the Umdat al-Ahkam by Abdul Ghani Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, and the Lum'a and other kutub. This was their methodology. Then they began the process of building a central masjid for the Ta'if. To begin this process. So Abu Umar al-Maqdisi begins with all halal wealth building the structure. He gets partway through the building and runs out of money. So he says, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not willed me to finish this task. But somehow it comes to be the case that one of the Imams of the time, Mudhaffar-ud-Din Kawkab-Dari, who's in Iraq, nowhere near Sham, comes to hear about a great wali of Allah undertaking a great project. So he gives some darahim to his emissary. His emissary makes his way to Sham. Upon making his way to Sham, he comes to meet Abu Umar al-Maqdisi and tries to convey greetings from Mudhaffar-ud-Din al-Kawkab-Dari and to give him these dirhams. But he says, I won't take anything that's of doubtful origin. Now remember, this man made this trip by riding beast all the way from Iraq to Damascus. We don't know what difficulties he undertook.
Indeed.
Now he has to go back. And he explains, this is what happened to me. So Mudhaffar-ud-Din says, I will give you another set that I'm sure of. So he checks his wealth, he examines everything, and he gives it. And now Abu Umar al-Maqdisi accepts it, and he finishes the task. Well, this portion is known as the Jami' al-Mudhaffar. Sometimes it's called the Jami' al-Mudhaffar, but it's also popularly known as Jami' al-Salihiyya, Jami' al-Hanabila. Because the side of town, they the people that had come from Nablus, like Abu Umar al-Maqdisi and others, they actually bought a plot of Damascus, and it was named the Salihiyah district.
Wow.
And so the Jamia of Salihiyah was named after this district, but it's also sometimes known as Jamia al-Wafiri.
And that Imam Abu Umar al-Maqdisi go particularly to this place because of the hadith about the area of Al-Ghawta?
Yes, the area about Al-Ghawta, he was particularly about this famous hadith in Abu Dawud and Ibn Majah that Taifa from his ummah, successful Taifa, will be in that area.
Subhanallah.
So he builds this, and his father doesn't live to see it complete. So he's buried on Jabal Qasyun. Abu Umar al-Maqdisi builds it, and then the curriculum gets put together, which is the Salihiyah system. So that gets put into place. So now you have the 4 rings being taught, these other things being done, right? So you have the lum'a, the things, the mufradat al-madhahib being taught. And so you start finding all these scholars called with As-Salihi attached to the end of their name, because they are graduates or attendees of this structure in this system. And that goes and flowers into the Palestinians and all these other groups. So this methodology, Shamsuddin ibn Qudamah, who dies 682, as well as Baha'uddin al-Maqdisi, who dies 624, these are patrons of this methodology. And they pass it on in Damascus, and they pass it on in today's Lebanon. And so it hands off to 2 figures, one of which is Jamal ad-Din ibn Abdul Hadi, who's actually from the Ibn Qudamah family himself, who dies 744, rahimahullah, and Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah, who dies 728 of the Hijri, because he's around this methodology from his father, who's Shihabuddin ibn Taymiyyah, who dies 682, and his grandfather, who dies 653, is also recipient of this principle laid down of as-sabr wa samaha, of patience and sobriety, which is the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This deen, the deen al-Hanifiyya, the religion, the pure religion, is one of patience and sobriety. Right? And this is the methodology that they're coming through. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim is also a patron of this particular principle and winds up writing his Madarij al-Salikin on Manazil al-Sa'idin, because other Sufis, because of how sober and calm and detailed it was, they attacked it. And so Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah actually defended Manazil al-Sa'idin by writing this, some printouts, I think it's 4 volumes, others it's 5. But Madarij al-Salikin is an excellent presentation, although Ibn al-Qayyim kind of took it another place because he got into usul there as well and other areas, but it's still a valuable contribution to this ta'ifa and the methodology of ta'lim, tahkim, and tatbiq. This principle carries on and is reached through Ibn Rajab, who dies 795 of the Hijri. And he is a recipient of this way. And much is written about this. It's inherited, this methodology, through Abdullah ibn Bata'ihi. It's a methodology taken through him, as well as Yusuf al-Ajami. And it also comes to Abu Bakr ibn Dawud As-Salihi, who dies in 806. Now he writes the text Al-Yawma wal-Layla fi Usbu', which is it's a series of awrad, afkar, and ad'iyah that someone does every day and night throughout the week, because he sees that there are corruptions that are being attributed to Tasawwuf. So he's one of the muhtasibin, he's one of the quality checkers in the time. And he sees that this process of corruption happens. Now, before I move from him, I want to mention something about the other three. Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani is the trendsetter of this. All others are his children, intellectually and spiritually. Now, of these three, you have Mu'in-ud-Din al-Chishti, or Shashti, because he's from Shasht, which is in Sistan, which is in today's Iran. He is reputed to have met Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani, but we don't have any text for definite of this. You have Shaykh As-Suhrawardi, Shihabuddin, who did meet Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani, rahimahullah, but it was not the original establisher of the tariq. It was his nephew and then also his son on another occasion. And on both occasions, Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani, rahimahullah, warned them against speculative theology or ilm al-kalam, told them to avoid excess in the religion. And he was hostile against it. As for Bahauddin Shah Naqshband, he's after the time of Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani. He's in Uzbekistan, Transoxania. Right, I had accidentally before said that Transoxania was in today's Turkey, but in actuality, it's in Uzbekistan. So he's way after these events, but it's supposed to be based upon the methodology that he had established. But as you know, when you get away from the original source, you start to, just like with recording devices, if you record copies upon copies upon copies, you start to get corruption. And this is precisely what started to happen, because the ecstatic utterances, those people still continued. And you also had people who not only had the ecstatic utterances, but you also had people that attributed things to it that had nothing to do with it. So one of them is Imaduddin Al-Hammazini, and he, rahimahullah, was from one of these tariqas called the Ahmadiyya, which was infamous for the fornication, child abuse, and just despicable things, to the point to where he, after meeting Taqi ibn Taymiyyah, who purified him of this fitna, he actually abandoned the study of Tasawwuf to begin it again, because he'd been so corrupted. And there had been such a sour taste put in his mouth. He started all over again. And he was a fantastic scholar, but he was just, as a young man on his journey, was adversely impacted. So this is the background that people like Abu Bakr ibn Dawud As-Salihi start doing the ihtisab, or the quality checking of this way of tasawwuf. And he bequeaths this methodology to his son Abdul Rahman ibn Abi Bakr As-Salihi, who writes a sharh on his book of awrad, where he actually gives the takhrij, because when you look at the awrad of this tariq from Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani all the way down, when you actually look at this, most of these awrad are either directly from the hadith collections or they're variants of the hadith. So if you look at, say, the awrad of Shaykh Abu Bakr ibn Abi Dawud, his text, you can all find them in like Al-Jami' al-Saghir by Imam al-Suyuti, just La ilaha illallah, Allahumma, they're all in there. So Abdul Rahman, As-Salihi, he does the takhrij of all these, because during the time of Abdul Rahman As-Salihi, he comes from the era of the Muhtasibin in his time, are now doing the takhrij on all these things, because now you have certain things being attributed to the big imams of the past that we know they lied on. This was happening even in Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah, even in his time. That's why he rejected Shantufi's books and everything, because the lies that were attributed, because Imam Abu Ja'far al-Adfuwi, he said that the origin of the lies in Shantufi's book was actually coming from Shantufi. So the lies that were attributed to Shaykh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani, that's in the era of Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, let alone after that time. So then he bequeaths this methodology to another Salihi graduate, which is Musa ibn Ahmed al-Hajjawi, rahimahullah, who is the writer of Al-Iqna' as well as Zadul Mustaqni', as well as his Manzuma fil Adab, his text on Adab, which is taken from another great Imam, which is Ibn Abdul Qawi, Ibn Badran, who is the more recent ancestor of the Ibn Badran family of Duma. He is the inheritor of this. And the inheritor of it was another Imam who lived around 1000 Hijri, who's Nur ad-Din ibn Muhammad al-Fissi al-Ba'ali al-Qadiri. Ba'ali is coming from Lebanon, he's Phoenician. Ba'ali because he's coming from Ba'alabek, right? So this is the methodology of quality checking that's come down to us. And after this time, you have people, or around this time, you have people like Ahmed ibn Atwa, you have other people around this time, such as Imam Muhammad Ahmad al-Safarini, right? Then you have some of the Imams of this Ta'ifa. There's also a subdivision that goes into Khalwatiyya, right? So you find all these Imams Khalwati. In fact, there's an Imam al-Khalwati who's related to Imam al-Buhuti, rahimahullah, who has a sharh on some of Buhuti's kutub. So you have these Khalwatiyya, right? Because some of the demands that were placed upon people from the Sunan, because all these things are coming from the Sunan, some of the things the people found hard to discharge these Sunan. And so people, Imams after, lightened it for them from the Khalwatiyya by saying, then just do this on Friday. Make sure to do these things on Friday. And so they told them to spend time in the day. They should have a portion of the day by themselves. They entrusted them with certain suwar to take away that are the sunnah to recite, rather than having them discharge the larger suwar like Dukhan and Mulk every single day, or Yasin every single day. That might be hard on some people, because as people's knowledge of fiqh and other things is decreasing, so are other sciences, people's ilm in it. It's not just, these areas that absolute mujtahids are decreasing. It's also big ulama and these other ulum that also is happening. So they're having to look after people in a way that is sufficient for them. And so they do this process, and then it reaches the Sufyan al-Qadumi family and the Lubadis and people like this, the Ruhaybis as well, because Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani rahimahullah had people that had visited. His son Salih had visited Duma, as well as Dumayr and Ruhayba, and some of his sons are buried there. And so these people knew about this tariq, and much of it is based upon this. So these Ruhaybi Imams, Imam Mustafa Ruhaybani is actually an Egyptian by birth and by background, but he's in Ruhayba and carries it there. Imams Dumayri, who lived just recently, he's from Dumayr. Right, you have the Ibn Badrans. They're coming from the Bubis family. They have this methodology because they're from the Banu Sa'ad, which is Halima Sa'adiyya, the one who breastfed the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, so these people on the father's side are related to them. Right, the Shami family, these people, they're related to them. And then Ismail ibn Badran and these others are from Ibn Badran through Ibn Abdul Qawi. And these are people that also have Abdul Qadir ibn Badran, Ismail ibn Badran, his sons as well, right? These people are part of that connection. Then you have the Shatis, which are the direct descendants of Ma'ruf al-Karhi, because their actual family name is Karhi. So on their father's side, they're direct descendants of Ma'ruf al-Karhi, one of the students of Imam Ahmed and a big Sufi, and one of the ones that assisted in the setting down of principles by Junaid al-Baghdadi, Sahaba Tariqatain. So all this methodology is related, which is one of patience and sobriety. So Imam al-Umari, when he's at Salihiyya, he lives around 1000 Hijri. He dies around 1000 Hijri. He writes his Mufradat al-Madhhab. Included in that is a curriculum for fiqh, ihsan, and other affairs. What we see today being taught, the same principles being taught today, either directly through the Qutb Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani or in some mukhtasar form. But it is the same principle of ta'lim, tahkim, and tatbiq. And in light of what's happened with this profusion of different tawa'if, all claiming that they're coming from the same wellspring,
Yes.
It does us our due diligence to return back to the originator of this, the original pool, the original river, in which all other tributaries come from, all of these other things. This is the tributary river that all others come from. This is where all the other water comes from. Because different creeks and lakes have what's called tributaries. It's where they get their water from. The tributary of all these people is Shaikh Abdul-Qadir Al-Jilani, rahimahullah, and his successors. So we judge them by this. If they come up short, then the areas they come up short, we don't acknowledge in the areas that they get it right, they get it right.